Thank you, John, for the introduction. And John and Richard, I've known John for not as long, but I've known John for a little bit and worked with Richard for, it seems like almost a decade now, for a while. You know, I'm from San Jose, so I don't know who's listening out in the web pod or whatever, but there's an East-West bookstore in Mountain View that I frequented quite a bit as a youth, and I'm one of those people, really, what you would find in common with me is not whether I'm Christian or not Christian, but whether you're a curious person and a seeker or not. Because that has been something I have always been, is someone who is inquisitive about life and seeks to walk past the boundaries into the borderlines sometimes. And so all that saying, to some, it might seem odd to have a Christian minister speaking at the Theosophical Society of America headquarters, but I don't think that is such an odd thing to do. And one of the things that I find in my own spirit a little frustrating is a place of Wheaton College. I don't know if you've ever heard of this place, Wheaton College. It's, you know, it's been here a little bit. Down the road, who are seeking to discern the sacred in their own way. And the Theosophical Society, not too far down. You know, I don't know. I don't have as good an arm as I used to, but maybe a stone's thrown down. But not as much connection as I think should be as far as working together. The title of my comments tonight is, what does salvation mean? Well, it certainly means that we need each other. I know that. And who knows how long the perennial philosophy will have to continue. See, I do know a little bit. The perennial, I'll drop a few theosophical terms here and there. How many more years we will learn before it is in the eyes of our neighbor that perhaps our salvation lies. So I'm grateful to be here. And, you know, I'm a big fan of the Council of the Parliament of World Religions, which was one of the first expositions of interfaith relations in 1893 in Chicago's the World's Fair. And I kind of think of the Theosophical Society of America as being one of the groundbreaking institutions that brought Eastern thought to America. Before there were Barnes and Nobles and Amazon.com, and you get whatever you want, no matter where you were from. I think that the Theosophical Society was making available different forms of seeking and thought that I think are important to a cultivated mind. So, all that to say, I'm grateful to be here. I don't believe in essentialized. Now, I teach at Elmhurst College, so I can talk like a professor at times if you want me to, all right? I don't believe in essentialized realities. That means I don't think there is something called Christianity that you can go out and it's the same everywhere, you know? I think in our understanding of a religion, of our religious sensibilities, sometimes it comes down to that understanding. If you really think there is a Buddhism, we joke at the Interfaith Council with John that he represents all global historical Buddhism. That's what John represents, all by himself. Or you believe that religious practice is conditioned by the context in which you find yourself. And so my remarks tonight are really going to be in a certain context that I'm going to seek, from my own perspective as a Christian minister, how to talk about other traditions other than my own. The first one is the great deal, more and more so, of religious diversity that we're experiencing in the United States. It's nothing new to the East. You know, I mean, it's embarrassing to even talk about, with someone from India, talking about, do you understand what religious diversity is? It's always been. And even within the traditions, there's great diversity within the diversity, right? But in the United States, especially with the passing of the Immigration Act in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson, it brought an influx of Eastern folks from the East. Well, I guess it depends if you want to be, you know, Eurocentric, but from the East. A lot more of our neighbors that we're seeing now that are making our communities very, very diverse. I would have never thought, and I think this is one of the great experiments of the Wheaton Interfaith Council, that there is as much diversity within Wheaton, which most folks think of as the evangelical lollipop land of the United States, that not only is Wheaton College there, but the Theosophical Society is down here, which represents a lot of diversity. We have 2 Islamic communities that I'm aware of within Wheaton. We have a Sikh Gurdwara within Wheaton, and I became aware of at the Theosophical, we also have a Baha'i community. Small one, but a small one there, but one that's here. And that just represents the tip of the iceberg. But for a nation that founded itself supposedly on Christian principles, I'm a Presbyterian, so I could argue with all these things, but some of us are waking up to the realization that we're not alone and that there's diversity in even places like the Midwest. I recently flew out to Omaha, Nebraska. I never thought I would end up in Omaha, Nebraska. My stepfather is from Giltner, Nebraska, close to it, and he would send me Omaha steaks for Christmas. Like, it's like when your dad, when you get older and your kids just give you like a tie for Christmas and that's what you get. My dad would just send me Omaha steaks for Christmas and I'd say, well, this isn't very original, but I like to eat. So I was actually there. Now, Omaha, Nebraska has a place, it's called the Tri-Faith Initiative there. And it's a place where a Reform synagogue, the American Islamic Institute, a mosque, and a UCC church have decided to build their 3 structures, communities, within the same space. Now, I won't get into this, but going out there, the last place on earth I would think I would find this interesting experiment in communalism in Omaha, Nebraska. As I was flying out there, I don't know if many of you have gone to Omaha, there is nothing. As you look out the window in your plane, you're wondering if you're going anywhere. There's nothing, and you're like miles up in the air, and there's nothing. You think, maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere, and then there's just this little dot of green that gets larger and larger, and that's Omaha. Well, even in a place like Omaha, Nebraska, there's interreligious diversity there. And so it's really something that I think a lot of folks outside of the United States are already comfortable with and take as a reality. But in the United States, it's an important statement or issue to realize that's our context. There are Christians that still believe we live in an ivory tower in which something snuck in. And then there are those who see the context of our times, much as the church became involved in the civil rights struggle, that we are provoked by our context to find faith or to seek the sacred in our context, that religious diversity is much the same. It's how will we practice our religious identities with others who are not of the same identity. I always think when we teach confirmation class at the church, we really should start it at the Shed Aquarium. Because you go to the Shed Aquarium and you look in there, and the diversity within the created order makes you feel foolish to think somehow it ends when it gets to humanity. Like the amount of diversity that is at the bottom of the ocean, where we can't even get down there. It's so dark and the pressure's too hard. There's tons of diversity we never see. It's not meant for us, but it is. And it's the same way I always think you should start off with the wonder of the nature of the created order, which is diverse. And diverse, from my perspective, diverse on purpose. It's purposeful. It's something that has to be wrestled with. The second thing is we live in a time where when you hear about a mass shooting in Texas or a bomb going off, luckily not detonated correctly, but in New York, we assume it's from a religious radical. We don't assume this is some anarchist that maybe in the 19th century they might have thought it was an anarchist or maybe a communist who's, Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist, that's what he did. In our day, if you hear of some tragedy of bloodshed, you immediately think this is religiously motivated. And so religious violence in our time is another thing that we are faced with. And I say we in that sense that we all have to deal with this whether we want to or not. Whether we want a future and what causes violence, what adds to it. And that question on how we deal with difference, how we're going to relate to that. I was downstairs in your library. I think the library here is the best in the world. I don't know. I haven't been many places, Richard, but I still like it. It's awesome. I take pictures in there. I don't know how to describe that place. I love it. But in the back, I was walking through where the Western things were, and I saw a book by Hans Küng on the wall, just in there. And Hans Küng is a famous Roman Catholic theologian who pretty much began, in many ways, the interreligious dialogue movement in the 70s, when it wasn't real popular to do so. And he's famous for saying, there will be no peace on earth, so to speak, until there is peace between the religions. So the burden of the violence in our communities is a religious one, and especially so in our day. So my question to myself, I'm going to just kind of reflect from my own Christian position. I could be up here and act like I'm not Christian and be real philosophical, but it's more entertaining if I talk about Jesus from time to time in kind of my day job. It makes it more interesting. But, do I have to give up being a Christian to embrace religious diversity? Now, that may seem like a silly thing to ask, but I think a lot of people, maybe a lot of people are sitting at home with a little cocoa and watching this live, and they didn't have to go out in the cold to get here. It's obvious what a Christian's perspective would be on religious diversity is be opposed to it. It's obvious historically what the Christian church has stood for or promoted throughout time has not been in favor of religious diversity. So if I get up here and affirm diversity within religious dimensions of our community, does that make me not a Christian, really? They say, well, you got someone to talk about religious diversity, but he's a Presbyterian. We know what real Christians think, right? There's a famous Latin phrase from the Reformation that Presbyterians are real proud of, and we say when we get into a corner and we don't know what to do. But it's semper reformanda, which is simply reforming, always reforming. Reforming, continuing always to reform. And I don't know if we've gotten too far as Reformation churches. The Presbyterian church is one of the Reformation churches. But at least when we face the context of our times, we will say, we certainly are not an essentialized entity. We are not finished. We're always open to reforming, to be reformed to our times. A couple of books I think that are interesting that talk about religious diversity from some different Christian perspectives. The first one's from Friedrich Schleiermacher, and he was a Prussian, German theologian in the late 18th century, but 19th century. And this is when the Enlightenment was in full swing, and all of the things of modernity were kicking in with the West, and people really thought of Christianity as kind of a backward type thing to have religious faith, to be an upstanding citizen of anything of these things called nation states that were forming at the time. One really had to be more empirical about it and be much more rationalistic. So he wrote a famous speech, and it's a book called Speeches to Christianity's Cultured Despisers, meaning that he kind of gave a defense of how Christianity isn't so backward, right? Isn't so backward. And he gave a lot of real sophisticated ways that Christianity fit with a more cosmopolitan understanding of the world. So, depending on where you are in your theology as a Christian, you either think Schleiermacher was the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning or something, as far as if you think he was a good guy or a bad guy. But to catch your attention, if that bored you, John Shelby Spong, to get everybody back focused here, to speak more in theosophical terms, John Shelby Spong has been a prophet to many folks as far as seeking to translate the Christian faith in a way that it needs reforming. And I won't get into the numerous books Spong has written. I know that he has spoken here, I believe, and is a friend to interreligious contexts and to more progressive open thinking. He has a new book coming out. I thought he was done. I didn't think he could, he's getting up there. But he's got a new book coming out. And John Spong has he's kind of got an edge on him. He's kind of like the James Dean of Christianity, and he kind of wants to tell you his views and then kind of punch you in the face, kind of a thing. So his new title of this book is called "Unbelievable: Why Neither Ancient Creeds or the Reformation Can Neither Produce a Living Faith Today." So it kind of gives away his tone, but That's another way of approaching Christianity as it deals with its environment. So there's no way this is going to work. To really move on to a more peaceful world, we got to let go of the most cherished beliefs of Christianity. It needs to go. As his title says, look, these creeds that Christians have used to kind of balance themselves are backward and violence-producing. The Reformation, which maybe I might speak of as being significant, it is like kindergarten compared to what we really need. So we've got John Spong speaking in that way. And then we've got a colleague of mine, Lillian Daniel. I know you have Pastor Seth Carey, I think, has spoken here a few years ago. But Lillian, who's out in Dubuque now, is a UCC writer, and she has a book called Tired of Apologizing for a Church I Don't Belong to. And she's got the Spong thing in her too, but she's always kind of uses some satire to how she speaks. And, I'm tired of defending myself against a Christianity that I don't believe in. Like, if you come to my church, I'm not going to say those backward things that you're going to accuse me of being. And it's one of those approaches to, I'm not going to apologize for something that I don't practice. And really what that's saying is there is no Christianity. There are people who practice different forms of Christianity, And so I'll speak for myself, but I will not defend against, let's say, homophobic bigotry, because I do not practice it myself, nor do I think Christianity should lead to that. So you can go down to somebody else and ask them why Christianity for them represents that. It does not for me. Okay. So you have that kind of an approach. And then these last two, I find really interesting. I thought maybe as I was talking, you'd all be writing down these titles like crazy, like, this is brilliant. Now I can read these things during the long winter here. But Peter Phan is a Roman Catholic theologian at Georgetown. And he gets in trouble with the Roman Catholic Church for what he writes. I mean, what's the point of being a Roman Catholic theologian if you don't get in trouble with the Vatican? I mean, you got no street cred. You got nothing if you don't get in trouble with the Vatican. But I picked up this book. I was reading it on the way to Omaha, but it's called The Joy of Religious Pluralism. Or the book before that was How to Be Religious Interreligiously. So he frames it as a Roman Catholic. So you don't get much more centrist than a Roman Catholic, right? Even if I'm a Presbyterian, I'm standing on the other end of the spectrum when the Roman Catholic's standing in the middle, right? There's a great joy to religious pluralism that being a Christian allows one to engage in. And he's Roman Catholic. Amos Young is an evangelical theologian who writes about a book he wrote called Hospitality and the Other. That is the main thing a Christian is asked to do in our lives, is to show hospitality to the stranger. So you can't really have a stranger if you're trying to convert them continually, because then they're you. You have to have a stranger who is strange to you and believes stranger things than you to practice hospitality at all. These last two authors, I think, are interesting because not only is one Roman Catholic and very centrist in his beliefs about Christianity, but the other one is evangelical, and is on the evangelical tour. I see him sometimes speaking at conferences for evangelical things, and very much has beliefs that would be similar to Wheaton College in that way. Interestingly, both of them are from Asia. Both of them are from Asia. And a great deal of the thought about religious plurality ain't coming from white folks in the church. It's coming from folks from Vietnam. It's coming from folks from Sri Lanka. It's coming from folks from India. It's coming from folks who are in a context of religious plurality already. And so they are more at ease in talking about these things, rather than the context of America, the Christian nation, which I would deny, but the Christian nation and the founding fathers and all this kind of thing. They weren't raised in that kind of a context. And so in many ways, if you wish to read about how a Christian approaches interreligiosity, you would read folks that aren't from here. I guess that's preaching to the choir a little bit here at the Theosophical Society, right? I'll move on. I see a few things historically that are challenges for the church. Are y'all with me? Is this good enough for coming out tonight? All right, was it $10 or some of you were free? Is this good enough? All right. The first thing is Christianity was born in apocalypticism. It was born in a sectarian environment. So the birthing of Christianity in that time period, Richard Smiley is one of the smartest people I know. I'm sure he could lecture on this on his own. But you get in a sectarian environment, you go into Kabul in the middle of the Middle East, or drones are dropping bombs on your family and coming from the West, you're going to get sectarian religion pop up right in the middle of there. You're not going to get a religious expression that is going to be ecumenical or pluralistic or generous in that way. You're going to get a religion that is formed by extreme violence and a need to survive. And so apocalypticism is where Christianity was born. That is, as a minority movement, I would argue, a minority oppressed movement in the Roman Empire, both within Judaism, Second Temple Judaism at the time, within the religiosity of the Roman Empire, but also eventually of the Roman Empire itself. So if you are someone who wants to frame how you respond to religious plurality, that's going to be a challenge of the Christian tradition. The folks that are on TV talking about how we need to burn Qurans in our church services, they are reading the Bible in a sectarian way, which is in many ways where the church was born, out of that kind of heat. So that's a struggle. Some of the things I'm going to mention are just questions. You may go ponder it afterwards. But it's a challenge for Christianity to find an embracing global vision. When it was born, it was birthed in a very narrow space. A second thing historically that happened is, ironically, this minority sectarian movement became the religion of the empire. So we call this Constantinianism. The Emperor Constantine, back in those days, you just were what the emperor was. So he just decided to become, I don't even, we get into why he did this. I mean, he didn't get baptized till on his deathbed, so that tells you something about exactly how deep his convictions were. The empire became Christian, and all of a sudden, everything that goes with empire, that is, it needs to be one God, one nation, one ruler. That had to be true of Christianity as well. And so answering the question of diversity, I don't know if you know this, but like the diversity in Turkey, it don't go down real well. Like right now with Erdogan, it's not well at all. Nation states don't always promote diversity or diverse thought or pluralism because it's got to be monolithic and there's one way or the highway, and somehow that's how you feel like you can pull power together. Christianity has been in that incubator for probably 1,700 years as far as having power. The question of the Lord of the Rings, which I'm always happy to see in the Quest bookstore, in any bookstore, and I'm reading to get through the winter, is not the question of whether Frodo should use the ring, which has great power for good. The question is whether you can ever use power for good. And the riddle of the ring is anyone who wears it is destroyed and destroys others. So the question of whether you can use power in a religious way, the Lord of the Rings says you cannot. And that's the burden of Christianity, is coming out of this great anxiety. Should I bring up Roy Moore? Maybe. As far as what he said the other day, that we're in some sort of civilizational thing that has to do with him. And that's that understanding that this empire that has been Christianity is crumbling. And how are you going to respond to that? So that's something to grapple with. And then there was the history of the expansion, all the great ships that were made. And, folks say the history of Christianity can be broken into two things: the Holocaust, the two major significant movements is the Holocaust and the colonization and genocide of the Americas in the 15th century. So we have a history of expansion from Europe and Spain. What came with it was a religious expression that sought to convert and dehumanize whoever it found. And so the only remnants of this that we have now is that we all live in, God, thank you God, a free religious environment, at least that we have to continually stand up for. But if you go to any church or any religious Christian arena, Billy Graham, there's only one way that you need to go. And that's still that religious imperialism, that has that background of expanding the empire as well. So, like I said, I could get up here and talk about, I could pretend I wasn't a Christian. I could keep beating up. You guys like how I've been beating up Christianity? Have I impressed you by that? I mean, is this guy even a pastor? Like, just hitting it. That's interesting to some point, but I think what's more significant is there's so many faithful Christians that go to church every Sunday, or they come on Easter and Christmas. We call them Creasters, all right? Maybe some of you are them. But, that are faithful, that breaking the tradition in half and saying, as Spong would say, these things are completely ridiculous and need to be thrown away. 2.4 billion Christians are not going to do that in the globe today. And so I would rather seek the treasures that have not been uncovered yet, but that are natural to the tradition. Examples of reaching out in a generous way to religious pluralism and the seeking of all of our salvation that I can do from the pulpit, as well as doing here. I think those are interesting ways to talk, so I'm going to do that. There are three main topics in systematic theology when I went to seminary at Fuller Seminary. I didn't know if when they said Fuller Seminary, you're just going to turn the lights off and just shut down the whole place. I went to Fuller Seminary, which was started by a televangelist. It's an interesting story. But you go to systematic, you want to learn Christianity in an academic way. It's broken down into creation, Christology, some Jesus stuff, and then the last part is soteriology. Okay, so when I went to seminary in 1994, it took me 6 years, but hey, I'm always kind of a late bloomer, all right? All you learned about other religions was in soteriology, and all you talked about was whether someone was going to heaven or hell. That was it. You didn't learn about what they believed. You didn't learn about anything. You just learned that either the world was going to end with the believers that go to God, or everyone else was going to go to hell, or do you believe in a literal hell or not? But you never talked about actual people. Like, you never talked about encountering people. Like, well, there's a Zen Buddhist place just next to the seminary. Have you ever spoken to them about how they express? No, we don't. We just keep talking about soteriology, right? So the church has moved quite a bit from that spot in the last, I'm getting older, but 25 years or so. And then now that when you go to seminary, we call it cemetery. You go there to lose your faith, is what we call that, cemetery. If it's good at what it does, you come out without any religious belief. But when you go there, you might get something called a Theology of Religions. Okay? What is Buddhism? I'm picking on you. What is Buddhism doing? How does a Christian relate to a Buddhist? What are we doing? How can I relate religiously to what a Buddhist believes or practices? I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but you will get that now. What does a Christian relate? How do they see Islam? What are Muslims doing, and how does that relate to? That didn't used to be talked about at all, right? But recently, within the last 5 years or so, there's something called a Theology of Religious Pluralism, which is religious diversity is a blessed given in life. God is behind it. Let us study it that way. Right? We're not going to do a rearguard fight against all the diversity we see in our cities and say, no, it must still be Christianity. We're going to realize, just like I talked about the Shedd Aquarium, there's great diversity, and that it is God ordained. And that therefore, when we talk about religious pluralism, it is a blessing given by God. At least I speak from my Christian perspective. It is a blessing given by God to understand. Diana Eck is a Methodist minister at Harvard, and she began a few years ago called the Pluralism Project. And she did a book on all this stuff, and she said, look, there is tolerance, and I'm a big believer in tolerance. I got like a poster on my wall that says tolerance. It's like, let's tolerate each other. But you go up to somebody and you say, look, it's so wonderful, you are Hindu and I'm Christian, I tolerate you. It's really good to see you. I tolerate you. Wonderful. I will stand here, you stand there, and I will tolerate you from across the room. This is a wonderful way to image a society. Diana Eck said, religious pluralism is more than toleration. It is an embracing of the other person. And it is an encouraging encouraging or an encouragement to religious pluralism. In the Wheaton Interfaith Council, we talk about this, whether the council is simply going to note pluralism is happening and we're not going to do anything to stop it. It is there, we accept it, or we're going to promote it. And those are two big differences. Because if I'm a Christian and I'm promoting religious diversity, what does that say? That means I'm okay with that? Like, I think that's a good thing? That's what that means. A theology of religious pluralism is a God-ordained gift to humanity, to all of us, that is a present underneath the tree. That was a great tree down there. Underneath the tree, it's a big box too. Maybe it's in there. You gotta look in there. It's a present that hasn't been unwrapped yet. And it's given to us at this time in our lives to really engage. So let me do some deep dogma with you, okay? Which means I'm going to use some religious symbols that Christians relate to. And I'm just going to tell you how I relate to a religiously plural environment by using them in my religious practice. Does that seem fair? Somewhat interesting? Okay. The Trinity. What some people say is Christianity's self-inflicted wound. Like, why? Why do you keep stabbing yourself with this doctrine? You can't even explain it. You get 12 Christians in the room, you get 13 opinions on the Trinity. Well, it's a symbol. It's an important symbol of the Christian faith. Then I would simply say, and this is just a very simple thing to say, for Christians to speak of reality or to apprehend the sacred, it must be done in a diverse way. It cannot be, God is not one. More of a monistic way of understanding God. There's just God, and I relate to God, and that's all I can do, right? There's just one, it's like my father. When he's in the room, he's the only one who talks. Like you just listen or you gotta leave. Like that's how we apprehend God. There is one God just in oneness. Well, where is there ever gonna be room for another person, right? Where is there ever room for anything else if there's just one? Monotheism is a tricky concept because in its strictest forms, it's kind of intolerant. And then there is, how about dualism? Now we know how this plays out. You know, God is not one because there's no room for, but there's two in God, right? There's two. Well, I know what happens with two people where one or two are gathered, there's an argument. And if if you got any Scottish blood in you, you know who's going to win. So one of the big issues of understanding our times or God is like, well, there's this against that, and this has got to win. But so the theory goes, or this illustration is, Trinity is you've got three people standing together. John, Richard, who knows what's going to happen? You see these guys? I don't know what's going to happen. But we're going to have to give and take because, Richard's, he knows everything, and John's kind of funny, and I'm barely a Christian. We're going to have to work out what, do you see how we're going to have to give and take, but it's not just one against one. It's not two, and one's got to win. There's three of us, right? You can make the argument that to live a single life is to understand life in a certain way and its beauty. To be married is another beautiful thing, or to have a relationship with somebody else is beautiful. But to have children or adopt children or see someone as your child creates a third. And there's something unique about that community. It creates community in a way that you have to give and take. I would simply say, and I would say from the pulpit, is that Christians attempt to talk about God in a triune way is a way that affirms participation by more than one person. That there are three in the conversation, and therefore naturally there has to be some give and take because you cannot control the corners. It's just an image, but I would say it's a helpful one. There are different organs of understanding reality. For a Christian who is Trinitarian, those realities are God as creator, God as seen in Jesus Christ, and God as seen in the Spirit. And I would simply say that for a Christian approaching diversity, we are given more than our two eyes, but actually, this isn't it is a trivocal. Hey, we're given different ways of apprehending something, okay? If I'm just being monistic, if you ever find a Christian, they go up and they're just kind of dealing with it, they're just kicking the can of, whoever down the street who's different from them, that's kind of a monistic, just a real, like, I'm the only thing that can be here. I can't take anything else in. But a Christian who is truly Trinitarian can take in the created order, like I just did with the Shed Aquarium, and say the created order tells me there's more going on here than just European Christianity. There's more going on here. I see the moon, and it's been there how many millions or billions of years and before I was ever here. More's going on. Yes, I can talk about Jesus and my understanding of God in Christ, but I also can talk about my apprehension of God in the Spirit, which is an interaction with people. The main word that's from spirit in the Greek and the Hebrew is breath. Well, you know something's alive if it breathes. Well, that means that I have to listen to things that breathe. And therefore, I sense God in those things. All right? So I want to just say those three things again as a Christian, how I can apprehend pluralism because of that. I already mentioned if I believe God is the creator, then I have to take account for the great pluralism found within the created order. I must take that into account. Or I'm not really being Trinitarian. I'm not really taking that seriously. The game is set up for me to learn something about it that way. And I would say that the beginning passages of the Bible where God creates everything that is in all of its pluralism and says it is good. That is something that a Christian who embraces religious pluralism has their foot locked around pretty strongly, is realizing, God put us here to interact with each other, right? And that it is good to do so. It's real popular to avoid religious statements that happen later in time. So if you read like Bart Ehrman or some different folks, the Incarnation was it came later. Go to the early stuff, which happens to be apocalyptic, but what are you going to do with that? But these different understandings of God, like the Incarnation. The Incarnation is the simplest thing of saying that God was present in Christ somehow. Okay? We've been arguing about it forever, at least Christians have been. God was in Christ reconciling himself to the world. I would say that for me, talking about religious pluralism of my neighbor who might be Hindu or Sikh, God chose to be fully present in the human being. And therefore, being human is lifted up. There's a great, strong architecture there for religious humanism. That is the most divine thing you will run into in this room is another person. And that divine carrier that is the human being is so profound that God's self, so the story goes, resides there. And so talking about incarnation, when I meet anybody of any tradition, I seek God's presence in them because I know God has done it before. And I know even if I primarily see it in Jesus, I have to apply it to other people. It lifts up the beauty of the human being. Not to, I've mentioned Wheaton College a few times here, but as you go into the Billy Graham Center, it used to be free. Now you have to give $1, and I usually kind of go here and then I go through, okay? But as you walk through there's a big poster of the crucifixion and stuff, and you keep going, and then this beautiful cross that's made of, it's not crystal, but it looks like crystal. It's white. And inside it is a human being. It's Jesus, it's a human being. I've always loved that because it's a sign of the lifting up of the human. In Christianity, there is great capacity to seek the sacred within the human. It's at the core. John Calvin, who came from Presbyterians or started them, you could think that's good or bad. He said there's two ways to know God. Look at the universe. Figure that out. Look at who must have made this. Or the second way to know God is look inside. Look inside. God dwelt within humanity in Christ. Look inside yourself. How's that for Gnostic? Yeah? Look inside yourself, and you will find God. So there's a powerful seed there for respect and to engage other people and to seek something worth seeking with the Incarnation. And then the last thing is the Spirit, right? The Trinity is God creator, Jesus, the Spirit. The Spirit is like the wind. It says in the Gospel of John, you don't know which way it's coming or going, but you can see the signs. You can see which way the tree goes. But the wind is unexpected. I used to take the kids out when they were little, and it was blowing wind. I'm like, get the kite. And I'd go out there, all right, get ready. And the wind's going the other way. And the kids are just saying, okay, let's go this way, turn this way. And the wind would go that way. I could never figure out like when the perfect day was where if you just run west, the wind's going to go east and you're going to fly that kite because you just can't tell. The whole point of the New Testament is that somehow God was present in a place and a person and a time that God should not have been. So there's a great surprise or irony, like in the Gospel of John. Irony of how is God present in this person that God should not be. Same thing when you encounter someone of a different tradition. It's just a principle of the Spirit. If you want to engage someone as a Christian in another part of the world of a different tradition, you don't start with Jesus, who they've never heard of, and who you're going to have to teach them everything you know about them, and then they won't quite get it, and then you condemn them, right? Because which is basically the missionary effort, right? You start with the Spirit, which is that God creates life, and it's unexpected. And when you encounter somebody, there's nothing more enticing, engaging, than to run into God when you didn't think you were going to. You see God coming out of whoever that person is that you didn't think God would come out. And to me, that is a part of the Trinitarian belief in God as a Christian. Is surprise, encounter. The Bible is filled with encounters that I'll talk about on Sunday if you care to come. All right. All right. Just a few things wrapping up here. Obviously, the word evangelism, not only are Presbyterians allergic to that word, because we would like to just read books and you just do it and you learn it through the book, but evangelism has been really misused historically. And I do believe humanity learns, but evangelism has not been good news for most of the cultures that have encountered it. And its byword is really imperialism. And so trying to understand evangelism in engaging other cultures, which I believe religions are part of, is to respect the cultures and that what you are sharing and being for them is really good news for them. So you really have to know the people you're engaging. And then it needs to be good news for them. It can't be this game of, well, it's good news for me and maybe not for everybody, but it stands on its own anyway. That's kind of a distorted game of who we believe God to be. But rather, what is good news is good news. Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations in 1993. And he believed our society was inevitable that we were all going to kill each other. And that we were all going to just get into our different zones of the earth and our different ideologies. And of course, Samuel believed that the Islamic ideology was this essentialist ideology of the East. Christians were of the West. He was unaware of Christians in the Holy Land, I guess, but and we're just going to clash. It's inevitable. And I believe Christians' understanding of God being present in Christ in vulnerability. So there's the cross. Somehow, in the most vulnerable aspect of who Jesus was as a person, which was, according to Christian theology, to allow this to occur, to allow other people to strip that person. And, it's like your worst day of being ill, and you come in and you're supposed to teach somebody something and you're just sneezing the whole time. Your most vulnerable time is when you are most able to communicate. So I would think that churches, if they truly understand what Christians call kenosis, which is the Greek word for self-emptying. To be a Christian is to empty yourself of power and pride, imperialism and all those things, and simply be vulnerable with somebody else who is different than you. There's the only reason you do these things if you were someone different, that perhaps we can communicate to each other. And, I am impressed by, I am so happy at the religious diversity that I encounter because I see God there. But it happens when you're vulnerable. It doesn't happen when you're trying to force your own thoughts down the other person's, mind. I was in Turkey. I'm hoping you feel like I'm a very profound person that travels the world. I was in Istanbul. They were giving these, anyway, I won't get into that. But I was with a Muslim colleague, and he was asking about Christianity, and I fell back on my Fuller Seminary training as far as, well, one of us must win. And so I said, well, how can the resurrection be this if Muslims this, that? And he just laughed. He said, Jay, I'm talking about, think of it like best practices. Sitting in Istanbul, like the center of the Ottoman Empire and I don't know, cultured Islam, so to speak, or whatever, cosmopolitan. And he just laughs at, look, it's like best practices. And I know that may seem like a bitter pill to some people who still want to take it for everything, but Christians more and more are talking about not what we believe, but how we practice our faith in front of other people, how we can embody what we believe for the betterment of other people. And that's how we know whether this is really of God or not. And certainly when I learn from my colleague across the table who's sick and seeks the service that is just embedded in them, I am humbled by it, changed by it, and want to learn from that. That's the kind of thing we're talking about as far as vulnerable witness, best practices in its literal sense. How do you practice your tradition? Well, you know the places that it's not practiced well because they're just in rubble, right? The Reformation. The Reformers believed that the Roman Catholic Church, and I went to a Roman Catholic seminary, the largest Roman Catholic seminary in the United States, so I love Roman Catholics. But the Reformers believed that there was an ancient tradition to understand God or Jesus, which was prophet. Jesus was a prophet, priest, and king. That he combined the best in how to function in a society to help it, but that the Roman Catholics were only doing the priest part. So they were really critical of the Roman priesthood. We all know that. I would say in a reformation of Christian praxis, how we behave, it's the same kind of thing. So I just kind of wrote these things down, but as far as understanding, for Christians, how to understand Jesus, a Christian is prophetic towards evil, sensitive to evil, prophetic response to empire, that prophet part of what it is to truly seek God, and a prophetic response to power. These are seeds that are deeply put into the Passion story, in its best sense, are those three things. A response to a sense of evil, to empire, and to power wielded. To be a prophetic against those things is to be a Christian praxis. And then the priestly part is to bless creation. Jesus is thought of as the second Adam over and over again in the New Testament. Adam was the priest, and Eve was the priest and priestess. I'm not sure how to spin that, just go with me. But they were the gardeners to bless the creation, to bless the garden. And so Christians must be priests, again, of blessing the creation, of understanding what the environment is in the ecosystem and blessing it, but also priestly in blessing the stranger. That's a blessing. When you don't know somebody and you don't know if they agree with everything you believe, you bless them. You sit with them. You listen to them. You give them the best place at the table. This is a Christian practice, or it should be. It's a priestly understanding. And then, instead of king, roll with me here, but the kingdom of God. I'm Presbyterian, so I want to say the reign of God, all right? But go with me because king gets in there better when I say kingdom. But the kingdom of God is what Jesus dreamed of. And so Christians can embrace plurality by seeking with others resurrection as a sign of the kingdom of God. Now, our church goes down the south side of Chicago. We got major problems of violence and all sorts of things on the south side of Chicago. I don't care who I'm standing with, because as a Christian, I believe in the resurrection of societies through justice, through all sorts of things, that I exhibit my Christianity in a pluralistic world by standing with folks to resurrect that which has been pulled down. I also think curiosity. There's so much irony in the New Testament stories of not seeing somebody and all of a sudden it was somebody. Of walking with somebody and you didn't know who they were and all of a sudden they were Jesus, right? They're angels unawares that you're walking with. To regain and recover signs of the kingdom of being curious about the other. To walk with other people. And then lastly, and when pastors say lastly, they've got about 20 more minutes, but I really am saying lastly. On the eve of what is said to be the greatest Star Wars film ever, which I have tickets for later this evening, which I'm very excited about. And I said, I'm not going to talk about it until I'm done doing this. Christians should be collectors of stories with surprise endings. Right? I mean, that is what the gospel is. It's a surprise. It's actually kind of a weird ending in a lot of ways. The more you get to know the gospel stories, the more bizarre they seem and how they end up. Christians embrace plurality by embracing other parts of that story that don't fit where we think they would go. Fantasy writers know this. I think the Gospels are a good spell in that way. They are the greatest fantasy there could be as a Christian, which is, this is good, it's mind-blowing stuff as far as how we can work together for what is best for all. So the best news about all this is just as a Christian who embraces salvation in a world of plurality, the good news is that the salvation is within us, and we work together to find it.
I have this question about Christianity embracing diversity and so on. It seems to me that when I discuss religion with members of other religions, I'm apparently told that the religion of the people I'm speaking to is the absolute truth. And I must accept that or be banished to perdition or something like that. And it seems to me that there's an element of judgmentalism in this diversity. Each religion judges other religions and says, you're false, my religion is true. And the other religion will say just the same thing. How do you explain this element of judgmentalism in each religion?
Well, I can't speak for each religion, but I can say that Jesus spoke mostly to Christians, and his word for them was hypocrite. And the hypocrisy is rooted deeply in the human soul. And all I can say is that what you've put in there as far as when you talk about someone else and they must be as you are, as a Christian, that is avoiding the cross, which is a self-negation of pride, a self-negation of power, and the vulnerability that Jesus exhibited by saying, I can influence more people by laying down in my vulnerability than in making you do what I say. So I can only answer it that way. But certainly, I'm trying to remember the book on the faith formation. You talk about different faith formations and ability to dialogue with other people, and there's like 4 or 5. Most people are born and die at 1, which is I'm right and you're wrong. And you need to accept, you need to become me. It's like a little baby. Like there's nothing else, but a baby can't tell the difference between the baby and its mother. It's just all themselves. Unfortunately, I think that's a human foible to think that somehow we exhaust all that could be. And I think there are things in every tradition that would break that down. But I can only speak as a Christian, at least that the parables that Jesus spoke always took what we thought was sure and turned them upside down and broke them open. So, but I know lots of people like that. Certainly.
Maybe this goes along with what your question was too, but I was raised Catholic and pretty much practiced Catholicism most of my early life, but now I would consider myself more Buddhist and Theosophist, and I'm just wondering, what's the chances of this idea of pluralism and diversity winning out in the long run, because we see a lot of what's going on in our country right now as being very, fundamentalism. And,
yeah. Well, I'm Presbyterian, so that means I'm supposed to be pessimistic about that answer. But I do think that there is hope. I'm sorry, but the fact that Roy Moore was voted down last night, I was somewhat pleased with that. But a lot of folks felt like, yeah, but like, what was it, like 49% of Texas voted for him. Well, I tend to just look at the other thing, which is that little by little, is it stalagmites? I think I said this on Sunday. Stalagmites, those things you find in the caverns, they are formed and they are sharp and they're directed upwards, but it takes millions of years for a little drop of water to finally form it. And I think that is the context of humanity, is that we are slowly being formed, but it takes a long time. And yeah, I would just say, I guess I just told you my own experience being raised in I would say what folks thought of as a fundamentalist seminary, Fuller Seminary, started from a televangelist in the 50s. And that now they have a chair of Islamic studies there. They teach these textbooks I just mentioned, they are there. So there is movement. But I don't have an answer for this pushback of fundamentalism that is so frightening. There's some Jungian archetypal stuff in there that I don't quite understand, but I know which side I'm going to fight for and seek understanding in my life. So.
Well, that was a great talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And, you're very kind about me, so I can only respond in the appropriate way of asking an extremely obnoxious question.
Yes.
Well, the thing about it is that, you are sort of talking about having, Christianity move toward acceptance of modernity. But the thing about it is that the churches that try to do that the most seem to be the ones that are most heavily losing membership, including, Bishop Spong's church.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those facts?
I think kind of how I presented is to re-embrace the tradition. So I don't think the answer to religious pluralism lies in becoming more modern. Germany was the most Christian, high-cultured, modern nation-state of the 20th century and was the most murderous. So I don't think modernity is the answer to all of us getting along. Being a religious person, I find re-embracing my tradition in the way I just did to be a path I want to go down to. And so I can find answers to peacemaking and blessing of the other in the Eucharist. I find that more significant than some of the arguments our friend Spong would espouse, however I respect him. So that tends to be where I'm throwing my dice.
I grew up a Methodist, and now I'm still a Christian. But even as a child, it never made any sense to me, the one way or the highway.
Yeah.
Nobody told me. All I ever heard was it was right, but it never made any sense. And then later on in life, where people were helping me deal with this stuff, people that are really trying to help, they said, well, the challenge for Christians is that you worship the container and not the content. And the content is really Christ consciousness. And you get a lot of that in the unity movement. And so that's sort of, I go to a Christian church and I'm probably similar to you. I can sort of talk to anybody. I know the words to say, so you can have a communication with anybody. But I was interesting, having you come here because sometimes I feel like I'm an outlaw in that when I'm around everybody, but deep within myself, I feel good about where I am.
Mm-hmm.